Hello and welcome to another episode of Antimatter Garage. Obviously, if you read the title, you'll know we're talking about the suspension on the MR2 Spyder. Here's the situation. When the car was new, it came with 15-inch wheels in the front and 16-inch wheels in the back. So in addition to staggering the tire widths front to back, they also staggered the sizes. So that makes it hard to find tires for it. The original car came with Bridgestones, but they've been discontinued. So I don't know how other Spyder guys handled this because I literally found no matches that had the same compound front and rear. It's possible people are buying different compounds or maybe at another store because I usually buy my stuff at a place called Tire Rack. Either way, I don't know. I've tried different compounds front to rear and I did not like it. The car got really squirrely on me and I bought two compounds I thought were as close together as I could get. So how I handled the situation was I put 16-inch wheels in the front. So now I just bought an extra set of rears and I put them on the front, and I was able to find a single tire that fit the width in the front and the back, and I've been running with that ever since. Currently there's only one, and it's Toyo Proxies. And so that's what I'm buying pretty much every time for the Spyder. However, when I did that with 16-inch rims in the front, and I'm running 205s, I think the original came with 185. So I'm running 205s, so it's a tiny bit wider, and 225s in the back, and I think those were like 205s or 215s in the back. So again, also a little bit wider. Now I did that in the back because my speedometer was off, and by going to a slightly wider tire, it corrected it. So how that happens when it's stock, I don't know. But in the front, when I did the 16s and the 205s, they're 45 series profile, I got a lot of rubbing. And so whenever I step on the brakes a hard turn, or like especially when I recently autocrossed the car, I was getting a bunch of scraping, and I can show you that it actually did some damage to the wheel well, the plastic liner. So to combat that, I wanted to stiffen up the suspension. I don't really want it super stiff. This is a street car. I want it to still be comfortable on the highway. I still drive it all over the place, not just on the track. And so I've ridden in really, really stiff cars, and I don't like it, not on the road anyway. So I looked for springs that were as close to the original spring rate as I could find. That spring rate, theoretically, for 2003 is 75 pounds per inch in the front and 112 pounds per inch in the back. The closest thing I could find were these TNs, and I'll show them to you and I'll tell you the spring rates. So here they are in my kitchen, and they are 106 in the front and 162 in the back. I only wanted about a 25% increase in stiffness, and that's a 40% increase in stiffness all around. But believe it or not, that was the least amount of stiffness that I could find on the internet. So I thought I would give them a try. I'll keep the stock springs so I can always swap them back if I want to. The problem is they lower the car by about 1.4 inches. And because that's not what I wanted to do, I need to find a way to bring it back up. I know most of you will think I'm nuts, but yeah, I don't want it lower because the point of making it stiffer is to keep it from rubbing, and if it lowers down, the stiffness probably will be overcome by the lowering, and it's going to rub again anyway. I could not find anything that makes the car go higher. I couldn't find a set of springs and shocks that didn't make it lower, so I'm going to have to come up with my own thing. So there you can see the hole that's been ripped right there in the plastic by the tire. There may be others, I don't know. Maybe that's the only place that it rubs. I haven't looked. Oh, up top there. Oh. I pulled paint off. I did not know that. Wow. Okay, that's not good at all. So I'm going to have to maybe get some touch-up or something on there so it doesn't rust. Or take another couple of corners and that'll just wipe the rust off. I think there are a lot of videos that show you how to change the suspension on cars, even on the MR2. So I'm kind of going to make this a quick breeze through, if I even post this at all, to be honest. Step one, as always, is to put on some good music. It's on the other side of the garage there. I can't do it because of copyright strikes, of course, but it will be there when I'm off camera. The second is to, in this case, is to measure the height that I have already between the wheel and the fender, which looks at least like this one's not rubbing. and that way I can compare to before and after, because I'll probably put it together with the springs and see if it really does lower it. I'm sure that it does. I may not because of the shocks. Anyway, the point is measure it ahead of time, and then you'll know where you're trying to reach afterward, because I like it to stay the same but stiffer so it won't rub. Same thing in the front. Then I'll know afterward. Next step after that would be to loosen the lug nuts on the wheels you're going to work on, because it's a rookie move not to do that before. Although some people have impact guns. If you're using an impact gun, it doesn't matter. Pull that off, start taking stuff apart. For me, the suspension goes usually pretty quickly. I think I could do all 4 of these in a day if I had the parts. I do not, however, have the parts. I can start working on this and get it apart, but the springs are here, as I showed you, but the shocks are not. I want to autocross this car next weekend, so I have to get this done, which is why I'm going to start now. But the shocks may arrive as late as Wednesday, and I'll be racing Sunday. So that's pushing it. Anyway, here we go. Okay, it is now Saturday morning, and this is what I did last night. I got it out, which is nice. So all I have to do is compress the spring and remove it. I went quickly through the removal process, and there are really only 2 little tricks that you need to know. The rest of it is all pretty straightforward. The first trick is that you should definitely loosen this nut before you remove it, because these 3 hold it in place for you to. If I try and remove it now, it just wants to spin. So it's just really hard to do. So and when I say it's not just these 3, right, you might think, oh sure, I can hold this plate no problem myself, but it's not that. There's a little notch that it catches on internally. Trust me on this. Now an impact wrench might get it off, because they have a tendency to spin things without turning them too much, but always easier just to get it off. But do not remove it completely, because when you remove the whole assembly, the spring will spring and pop everything off. So, but get it nice and loose so that you can then get it off when it's like this. The other is, I'll show you, the anti-sway bar connecting rod thingy. This is a ball joint in here, and if you're turning this, a lot of times, because it's kind of tight, the whole ball inside will turn. So this and this will turn together, and you're not loosening it at all. And they give you, conveniently in the end here, a lot of people don't know this, there's an Allen wrench, like hole. And you can stick an Allen wrench in there and hold the ball steady while you remove the nut. So all I have to do is get the spring compressor on this, remove the end, take this off. I don't think there's a lot of compression in this spring, but I thought this was the new spring, and I was a little confused that it was the same length. I figured stiffer, same length, it won't do anything, but it also seemed pretty soft. But that's when I looked and I saw that this actually had an F on it, which I assume means front. And it's actually this larger one that fits in there, and that makes a whole lot more sense. It just looked too big a diameter, in my opinion, but I think it's probably right. So the TN is a progressive spring. You can see how the coils get closer here, and then they're evenly spaced down here. I like that, actually. It does make it difficult to tell exactly what the spring rate is, but they posted it as, what I put on there earlier. All right. Other important things to mention when you're using a spring compressor. So I mentioned this the last time I did this on my wife's car, but I'll mention it again here. I saw a guy do a video on using these spring compressors, and he was saying how dangerous they were. In the whole video, the title basically was that, and then in the video he used them normally and had a normal result. And there was never anything dangerous about them. I don't see anything really dangerous about them. What's dangerous is not using them. So there are some notes, however. You're not supposed to use an air compressor on these, or like an impact gun to tighten these down. It's very tempting because you may have a long way to go, and it just gets tiring and annoying after a long time. But I think they just don't want things to happen fast when you're compressing a spring. For instance, when this pin hits this spot, you're done. If you go any further, pushing these together, you can bend that pin against the spring, and then you can't get the pin out, and you'll never get this off again unless you basically cut that off. And then, of course, you have to worry about it jumping out or whatever. Then another thing that I like, so that's the case here. You also want to grab as wide as you can. I have figured when I had difficulty, and I thought that I would just grab a couple of coils on the inside, or 3 or whatever I could get, and I would compress that much and it'd be enough, and then it wasn't. I had to undo the whole thing and then do it again by trying to grab something a little wider. Sometimes you just can't fit in there, and that's the case here, so I grabbed what I could. I do think it's better, you want them to be opposed from each other so that the spring doesn't start to curve. That can cause problems. But if you can't quite get 100%, or exactly 180 degrees apart, I think it's better to grab a wider coil a little off of 180 than it is to grab an inner one that's only 180. The other thing is, don't underestimate these springs. Even a small spring like this that you don't think is compressed very much, I speak from experience where I made that mistake, and they still have an awful lot of power, really. What I did was I couldn't get wide enough like this, and I compressed it, and I was getting some bind, and I said, okay, well, I'm 3/4 of the way there. How much power can be left? And I pulled it off the end, and this stuff shot across the garage. Like, I'm really glad my foot wasn't in the way, because it would have hurt pretty bad. And you can imagine if you had a truck spring or some other much more powerful spring than this little car, it could do a lot of damage. It could even kill, I think, in the wrong circumstances. So beware. The other thing, before you, like when you're doing this nut ahead of time, another thing you should do, in my case, I mark it in line, like with this guy down here. That way I know how to put this plate back on the car, because they often are, if you look at it, it's actually at an angle. It's not perfectly parallel to this bottom plate down here. So that's to allow for the angle at which this mounts in the car. That's how the angle is generated. So you want to make sure you don't put this on the wrong way. So definitely mark it. Okay, now I know I've compressed the spring enough because I can move the spring separately from the perch. There, you see how the spring is basically loose in there. So I don't have to go any further than this. Okay, you're going to need your bump stop, and I like to keep the boot, keeps the dirt off of it, but it's cut here. The problem is this is all one molded piece, so I probably have to go to Toyota to get it, and I don't really want to do that, so I might just live with this little piece torn off. For now I'll just leave it as it is. Now you can just pull the spring off. I don't need either of these at this point, to be honest. I really only needed that piece because I got a new shock and I've got a new spring. Next thing you want to do, always, is compare the new part to the old part. Not only in fit, but function. So I'm going to press on that because I've replaced shocks before and then found that they really weren't any different when I replaced them, so I didn't need to. It's always good to know. But even when you get the right part, which this appears to be, you can see the angles of all this stuff and the placement of all these things. And now I'm going to move this screw over and make sure it's the right thread and goes in that hole. It does. But even the right part can be wrong in some ways. For instance, you'll notice this cap here slightly different than this cap here. You have to check these things and make sure they're not going to give you a problem. I don't believe that's going to be a problem in this case, but again, it always helps just to make sure, Lengths look good. Everything here looks pretty good. So this is the old shock. I'm just going to push down on it and see what it feels like. I mean, I suppose you could measure this, but I'm just going to go by feel and see what that feels like. And I'm going to do this one the same way. Yeah. You can see how the new one is extending much quicker than the old one, so there's definitely a difference there. It felt about the same going in, but obviously it's not feeling the same coming out. So, were they shot? Were the shocks shot? I don't know. Neighbor's dog's being a pain, so forgive the barking. Now what I'm going to do is compare a couple things. The first thing I'm going to do is compare the new spring to the old spring. You can see that it's actually 1.2 inches lower already, or 1.4, whatever it's supposed to be. But mostly, I want to compare sort of the design. I can also just sort of push down on it. Can't really tell anything from that. The other thing I want to do is make sure the numbers on these two are the same. If they're not the same, then I'm going to need to figure out which one's right, which one's left. I don't see any reason why they would be different. So they're marked R, that's good. This is the rear. PIL23. It's like a 0U0 XF1, and they are indeed the same. So I don't know if it goes this way or that way. I'm assuming it goes this way, but I'll now work on that. But the big thing I've got to do is figure out how to raise this back up to where it was. Okay, I've already explained why I want to raise it back up, because my wheels are rubbing and I don't want that to be the case. I don't want to change the dynamics of the vehicle either, and that's an important point here. I'll probably get a lot of pushback on this if anybody ever watches this video, but it's my opinion that cars should not be lowered. I mean, I like a lowered car, especially if it's just the right amount. I mean, I don't really like when they're in the weeds, and I don't really like them when they're lifted. But honestly, you really shouldn't change that at all, because the only proper way to do it is to remove the entire suspension and move it up 1 inch, 2 inches, however much drop you want. And that includes the mounting points on the chassis, the ball joints, everything. All has to go together. If you just shorten the springs, as this would do, then if I have McPherson struts like this, then what I'm doing is I'm changing the angles. It's as if the car is under compression already. And so, I'm not saying you can't get away with it. Obviously, race cars do. A lot of people do. They even, get better handling. It is possible, but those angles have all been determined by the manufacturer, and when you just change one component in it, you change that angle, and your virtual swing arm, all these things you can look up on the internet, change. So really the only right way to do it is to take the entire suspension and just shift it up in the car so that the car comes down to where you want it. And I don't know if he's going to cut off, bounce, and try and figure out a way to weld that all back on and without bumping into other things and stuff. It's just not, it's not going to happen. It's not very realistic, to be honest. So to me, it's always best to leave it where it is. Now, I have kind of lowered my Corolla because I wanted the look, and I realized I was going to be making a sacrifice when I did that. But I also only went a little bit, and I think the less you go, the further off you are, or the less far off you are, and the less of an effect it actually has. But I do believe it has an effect. So anyway, opinions vary, but that's mine. I've read books on the subject, and I think I have a lot of backing behind me when I say that. But in my case, it's more important that I just keep the ride height the same, because I don't want to have my wheels rub. So that means I got to come up with some kind of a shim to put in there, and I looked on the internet, and I found some, but they were all like for trucks, to lift trucks, and they went in between the springs. I need something on the end. I don't want to affect the spring compression. They were the wrong diameter. They were plastic. I didn't like any of that. I'm going to figure something out now. Okay, I have a plan. It's not a great plan, but we'll just call it Plan A for now. There is no Plan B at this point. As you can see, there's the difference in height, right? I practically don't even need to compress this spring to get the top hat on, and this one obviously sticks up over the top. So I need a shim either at the bottom or at the top. Both of them, though, are not flat, and that presents a problem. For instance, let me show you this. This is from Ground Control. And Ground Control uses iBox springs, which is nice. They're a major manufacturer of most springs on cars, I think. They make sure all of theirs are flat on the bottom, which makes it really easy to change them out if you just get more springs that are flat. I have mixed feelings about Ground Control. I think if you're like maybe racing or something, they're pretty good, but they work on my Corolla all right, but they don't work on my wife's Solara very well. So I had these left over, which is handy for me because they would be adjustable then, so I can pull exactly out as much as I put in, assuming that the minimum isn't too much. But the problem I have is the spring doesn't sit there. Obviously, it's not flat. It needs to have that seat here. It needs to have this seat shape in it, right? So that the spring fits in nicely. Well, as it turns out, I have an old shock. And I've done this on my wife's car, and it's working so far. It's been in there for years. What I did, and what I intend to do here, is I'll knock this cap off. Then I will try and cut these welds. It's not easy. Along here. And get this plate off. I knock this cap off, and I slide that plate over it until it matches perfectly with that. But I put this in between. That's the plan. Okay, I feel like I've gone deep enough, very carefully around, not to penetrate the tube. I think I need to try and flatten this out. I mean, ideally, I'd take a mill and, mill this down flat, but I don't have a mill, so I'll just eyeball it with a angle grinder or Dremel tool as I did the rest of it. I removed this dust cap, and I slid this on, and you can see it raised it up, but I don't think that's enough. I realize this may be backlit a little bit, but alright, so what I'm getting, I zero it out, good enough, is a delta of, and you got to make sure they're lined up properly, right there actually. 1 inch. That's pretty good. Theoretically, that would drop the car 0.4 inches on, or 0.2, I'm not sure, because it depends on front or back. I don't remember which one's 1.4, which one's 1.2. But, okay, so all I would need would be some kind of a ring that can go over this. I measured this. This is a 2-inch OD tube. OD means outside diameter. Everything I have in my garage is also 2-inch OD, which means it won't slide over this. I need something bigger than that. So I think I may have found my answer in the dust cap that goes on this. Alright, I was able to put this part on the lathe and turn that flat, and that brought my gap down to 0.86 inches, so down from a full inch. That means that's what I'm going to have to make up with whatever I come up with here. There's the end result. So you got the ring in there. I painted everything just to keep the rust off. I measured it, 1.3. So it's 1/10 of an inch taller than it was, theoretically, than it would have started at, because it's a 1.2 inch drop. I go up 1.3, pretty close to stock, 1/10 of an inch, no big deal. Springs will sag over time, they'll come down a little bit anyway, so that's the right side. Now I just got to reassemble in reverse order. So here's a reason to do stuff one side at a time, because if you get something upside down or backward or something and you're not really certain, you can always look at the other side if you haven't taken it apart already. This is an interesting little conundrum here because I looked carefully how this spring came out, and I found that this part here, which is kind of wide, versus this part over here, which is kind of flatter, the wide one was at the bottom. The new spring has the same thing. So if I put the wide part at the bottom, put it in, notice it doesn't quite sit straight. Even if I sort of move it around a little bit, it doesn't want to sit straight. But at the same time, if I flip it over this way, much straighter. But I'm pretty sure that is wrong because the TN is now upside down. I think in theory, spring should work the same either way, so it kind of wouldn't matter. But what I thought typically does matter, and I'll take a look in a second here, is that this spring starts here, right? And the other spring comes close to a full turn there. Whereas this one starts down there. And up here you can see there's almost half a turn basically missing. So if the seat at the top has a notch, it'll be in the wrong place for this spring. Here is that part. And it looks reasonably flat, so that's a good thing. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in with the TN facing upward, even though it seems to want to go at a slight angle, and put it all together that way. Before you put it together, don't forget to put your bump stop in, because that really sucks to put it together and not have that in. Also, mine has a little spacer at the top, goes right here, goes down in there. Then they provide you a new nut, and you should use that new nut because it's a nylock. There is a nylon piece at the top here that gets, it's not reusable theoretically. So that's why I always give you a new one. And finally, you need to pay attention to this flat right here, because it goes into the flat right there. Hope you can see that. And remember, this part has to go outboard, so you have to turn this shaft until that flat lines up with that flat when the white line that I made earlier, as I showed you, goes outboard. In fact, you can see the flat is essentially inboard. I'll move it around. There you go. There's the flat. The end of the spring is right there, and I have my white mark is here on the outside, lined up, right? So I'm going to tighten this down enough so that when I release the spring pressure, this doesn't come off, and you torque it down after it's on the car and the weight of the car is on it. And there it is installed. I've got everything reconnected, but I haven't tightened any of the bolts yet because I'm going to torque them down, of course. Well, I've put this in my other videos, but nobody really watches my videos, so I'll put it here again for the few who do. I always make a procedure, and I write down pretty much everything I do, including some extra notes in case there's something I notice that's important, and even little drawings that show how I measured things, just because I suffer from CRS and can't remember stuff. So I will forget literally in 5 minutes, but a lot of times what happens is I think it's only going to be 5 minutes, then something interrupts me, I go away, and I come back and suddenly, gee, where do these bolts go? So I do that, and then I just go back up the procedure and make sure every single one is ticked off. None of them are ticked off now because I haven't done them yet. That's because I'm going to give you a little gift. Here is, you can pause the screen if you want the torque specs for the entire rear of the Spyder. And I'm about to torque all these things on, and then I'll mark them off. And I usually put the torque value, next to my procedure so that I know that I did it. Okay, everything's torqued except the top, but I put the car back down on the ground. And as you can see, the height looks really good. To be honest, I'm a little bummed it isn't lower, but this is what I expected. This is what I wanted. I wanted it to stay where it was. This gap will close up a little bit because if you've ever put a car on the ground before, you'll know that it takes a little while for the suspension to settle. You may even have to drive, a little bit. You'd think it'd just settle the minute you move it out of the driveway, but it does have to settle sometimes over a little bit longer period of time. So whatever this gap is will be almost a ½ inch lower, I think, when it's done. But I'm going to measure it now and find out what it actually is. So the gap, if you look straight across the center of the tire, was 2 inches before, and it's right around 2 inches now, maybe a tiny bit more, but I did have the suspension up before I made that measurement, so it's not the fully down position either way. So this is close to apples, so I think I'm there, and plus the old springs had already sagged, so over time I think it'll come back to exactly where it was, which is what I was hoping for. And you can hopefully see up there a little bit the spacer that I put in, so hopefully that'll stop all my dragging, and hopefully the car won't roll quite as much. Can't wait to drive it, but then now I got to do the front. And there are the torque specs for the top. It's the last one here, 59 for the 3 and 54 for the center one. So when you torque these down, I would torque these 3 first and then torque this one, because what I was noticing is as I was torquing this one, I got a little bit of motion out of these 3 because just a little bit of slop in there. So I would torque these 3 first and then do that one last. Okay, I'm ready to spray this little tiny spot underneath the fender that I showed earlier. You can see right there, hopefully, that there is a bare spot. Worse than that, it actually pushed the fender out a little bit. Fortunately, it's not real noticeable and it doesn't look bad, so I'm not going to worry about that. But I'm glad I'm doing this to prevent any further damage. Just for, a side note, if you're going to paint your car, don't use newspaper to mask it off because it's you get bleed through. I'm just stopping incidental overspray from coming down. I even put a little lip here because I'm going to be spraying, sort of outward, right? So the process I'm using in the front is virtually identical to what I did in the back. There's only a couple of small differences. One is that this has a bearing in it so you can turn your wheels, right? With an extra piece underneath, and this is the way they go. I'll show you before I put them back on how they go. I think I'll know how they go because I marked this one, but it occurred to me it may have turned. It turns very easily, and it may have turned because I noticed some goop looked like it was in the wrong direction. So, but it looks very, very flat to me. A lot of cars have a slight angle on them, but I think it kind of maybe doesn't matter. Also, it looks to me like this distance, I haven't measured it, it may not be an equilateral triangle. Anyway, you might want to mark that when you take it out of your car. This part is visible. You could mark it up here. It's very greasy, so it may be hard to do. But I wish I had done that so I know how to put it back in just right. The other thing is that you do not need to disconnect the sway bar because it's not attached to the shock, it's actually attached to the lower control arm. Check it out. Here's my hand. Last time I saw a spring that small, it was in a watch. Okay, I just figured something out because I'm intellectually challenged. Everybody else probably could have seen this for themselves, but you'll notice that the seat down here where this spring seat sits has got a little indentation there to allow for that angle on it, right? But up here it's very flat, and so if you look here on this spring, it's comes at a fairly sharp angle, and up here it's not flat, but it's pretty close to flat. So that tells you right away, in addition to being right side up due to the name being right side up, that this goes in the bottom in the seat. Houston, we have a problem. Yeah, there always has to be one, doesn't there? I didn't notice this before, but when I was trying to put this ring on, I got to a point where it didn't seem to want to go anymore, and because it's already being kind of forced on since it's a cap and it's meant to fit tight there. And I didn't see before that this actually necks out. So this isn't gonna, theoretically there's plenty of space there to force it, but I don't think that's gonna happen. I measured it. The outside diameter here is 1.911 inches. So theoretically, something with a 2-inch ID, that's internal diameter, would slip over. But everything I have here is a 2-inch OD. So now I got to figure out another way around. This is going to bring everything to a screeching halt for today anyway. Okay, I'd like to point out at this point that cough drop, that this problem may be pretty easy to solve for a lot of people because there's a difference between tubes and pipes. A tube is typically measured by the outside diameter, and a pipe is measured by the inside diameter. There are other differences, but the point is you might be able to go by a pipe, a 2-inch pipe, and it might slide right over the shock just fine. And that would be the way to handle it, I think, if you go to like hardware store or whatever and get a pipe instead of a tube and then cut it to length. I, however, have decided to use some stuff I have laying around. So I'm just going to cut this. It's not 2 inches ID, it's 2 inches OD. However, it's really close. On the inside, it's like 1.8 something, and I need 1.9. So I think I'm going to cut off what I need and then put a slit, making a C. It'll spring out. I'll slide it over and mark the spot I need to keep it at, and then I'll weld that seam back shut again. Mostly just because I don't want to go buy more pipe when I've got stuff like this laying around. And this is really thick. I mean, it's got some, needs to be cleaned up on the end, but it's a pretty thick wall. Also, you'll notice there's no rust on it, despite the fact it's been sitting in my garage for a while. So I'm pretty sure this is galvanized. You have to be careful when you cut or weld on galvanized. The gas that comes off is not good for you. So yeah, that's it. Alright, so there it is. And you can see this tube is a pretty good match for the original tube, diameter anyway. And this is 1.4 inches from top to top. It's 1.5 from top to bottom. Now all I have to do is weld that seam, which is right there. And it can get squeezed in a little bit, I think. Okay, I've made a rookie mistake, and I don't know why I pointed this out like every time I do it, but in this case, I don't know, I just didn't see it for some reason. But what holds the shaft in place when you're trying to tighten that down are the flats. You can see right there, there's a flat, another flat on the other side, and they fit into these flats on the back here. So when this goes on, it has to go on with those aligned, otherwise the shaft will turn. You'd think it would fall right in, but it doesn't. So what I said earlier about torquing this down on the car, because then all the pressure will be taken off the bolt, you're going to have to take that pressure off on the bench using your spring compressors and torque it down on the bench, which isn't that easy. Alright, so here's what I'm talking about. I've got the spring compressed very far down now, and you can see these flats here and these flats here. They'll line up, I'll go unlined, and then they just, there. When you do that, and this holds this shaft from spinning when you tighten the nut on the end. But you have to remember to leave enough for the rubber as well. So I may not, and I like to mark I like to mark the top of this in line with those lines, which I thought I'd done, but I'd actually mark this in line with that. I mark everything in line with that always, and it is actually a little off this side, but the flats weren't. Now, mind you, this shaft can spin, so that can kind of go anywhere. So you have to kind of mark both. I usually mark the top, but this had so much grease on it, I was having trouble getting a mark to stick. So with the rubber on, let's see if I can still get it to... Yeah, and if you... nope, that's not working. There, you can see that when I turn the top, the shaft is spinning. This is the new part, and it has a bearing back here with a seal on it. That's probably enough. I put grease on mine to keep the dirt out, to keep any dirt from getting out. Although, of course, it may have the opposite effect. Maybe I'm getting dirt in the grease and it's making it worse. I don't know, but I put grease on it. Then I put it on. And you have to tighten the bolt all the way down until it's seated. If you leave it a little bit loose, this bolt here, then this can move up and down. It won't be grabbing those flats anymore. So you got to make sure you put all the way down. If you can feel it like sort of bottom out, and I believe then you'll be able to torque it down. In this case, I tend to do it on the car. I hope it won't turn. If it does, this part will be turning too, but there's a lot of spring pressure. So I'm thinking I can do it. Otherwise, you're going to have to find a way to hold the entire shot. While I'm here, I like to clean underneath here. Just figure that dirt under there is just going to grind away at the paint. Maybe cause it to rust. If you're using a new one of these, don't forget to take off the little plastic things. that are protecting the bolts. You wouldn't want to think that they're too big and won't fit through the hole and then drive all the way back to the parts store and tell the guy there that you couldn't use the parts because they didn't fit because the bolts were too big, only to have him show you that these things were on there and they do fit and make you feel like an idiot. You wouldn't want that, right? So yeah, take those off and then put them up in there. Then when you're installing, make sure you push up on the shock and put these all the way down as tight as you can with just your fingers. Because again, I think that leaving a gap on the back, on the underside, is what caused my torque not to be even, and then I started stretching the bolts, and in the past I even broke one. But yeah, I think you want to make these tight. There'll still be plenty of room. There'll still be plenty. You can still move this around a bit to get these two together. Bolts go on front to back, and top to bottom, always, unless there's a compelling reason not to, like you can't get to the nut or something, or the manufacturer specifies differently. Another thing I wanted to show you is this. Some wheels come with a little spacer in the back. Mine does, and sometimes they can come out. This one did. The other three all stuck in there. But make sure you put that in there. It helps center the wheel, you know, on the car when you're going to put them on. So there are the torque spikes for the front shock absorber. Alright, full disclosure here, I was not able to tighten these after they were in the car. I really prefer the design on the rear much better than this design here, but apparently it was turning the nuts tight, so it turns the shaft, which turns that plate I told you about that holds it in place. Apparently it's just not in strong enough to hold it. You have to torque that before you put it back in the car. So I didn't have a way to do that here. I have a vise, but I didn't see any way to do it. So I'm just going to leave it hand tight. I mean, it was done with a wrench, but it was, you know, I felt it bottom out. I just don't think these things are going anywhere. I mean, the only time it really comes into play is under full droop, and it's not like I'm jumping my car, so I'm not going to worry about it. But, you know, if that makes you nervous, then make sure you torque that down on the bench.